You're listening to Past Imperfect, a global and Indian history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Mention the word partition in South Asia and, almost automatically, we think of 1947. But what if we're missing a longer and more complex story? Sam Dalrymple, the author of Shattered Lands, joins us to discuss 5 partitions in the former British Indian Empire between 1937 and 1971. Spanning territory from the Red Sea to Rangoon, this is the story of how 12 nation-states came into being and how several continuing conflicts, ranging from civil wars in Yemen and Burma to separatist activity in India and Pakistan, originated. Thanks, Sam, for joining us today. And I'll just mention before we begin that this continues a conversation that Sam and I had at Literature Live, the Mumbai Literary Festival, in early November. Thanks for agreeing to continue our conversation.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, after what last time was one of the loveliest conversations I think I've had about the book. No, it's wonderful to be on the show.
Great. So I want to begin by asking something that's not normally the purview of historians, and that is virtual reality. When you were in college, you established something called Project Dastan, where you helped survivors of partition through virtual technology. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about this particular project.
Sure. So this book of mine, essentially Shattered Lands, originates from this Project Dastan. The idea came in college when we were in Oxford with my friend Sparsh, who's Indian origin Australian, and then our friends Amina and Sadia, who are both Pakistani. And there was this strange realization that our conversation could not really happen back in the subcontinent. And also a kind of strange realization that although, like for Sparsh, his ancestral home, pre-partition, is now lost to him and his family, sitting on the other side of the Indo-Pakistani border, one of the fiercest borders on planet Earth. For Sadia and Amina, it was a kind of 2-hour drive from Islamabad. And so we realized that technology could help bridge this gap and help reconnect people with their ancestral homes and communities. And so we set up this company, Project Dastan, to do that, using virtual reality to show people their old homes, mandirs, gurdwaras, sweet shops, schools, places where they went on their first dates, and possibly even reconnect them with old family friends who remained on the other side of partition's borders. And so, we were doing that for about 3 years, from, I want to say, 2018 till about 4 years, 2018 to 2022. And it's been wonderful.
When you talk to people who survived through partition, what do you find in common that they say? What are the memories that they reflect upon? I mean, this is something after all that took place nearly 8 decades ago now.
Sure. I think that there's many things, but I think one of the most common things that we found with Project Dastan was that these stories had often been silent. There had been a silence surrounding them until very recently. And I think that in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Britain, I think in particular the 70th and 75th anniversary of partitions sort of opened the floodgates in some sense, unlike earlier anniversaries where there were also brilliant scholars who went out to try and document partition stories, Urvashi Patalia being a classic example some decades ago. I think that these recent anniversaries have been accompanied by a sense that these stories might be disappearing soon, and particularly grandchildren would often reach out to us at Project Dastan saying, kind of, in such a world where the border disappears finally, or, we have a kind of EU-style system potentially 50, 60 years from now, once this conflict is resolved. They want to know where their family came from. They want to know the name of the road, the temple, the Gurdwara, whatever it might be. And it's often been the youngest generation who is pushing to record these stories. Whereas, I think previous generations had often been quite happy to let it disappear. And what's interesting is how similar this is to what Holocaust historians talk about, that there was the silence. Some people would talk about it in the 80s, etc. But in more recent decades, there was a sudden urgency to it that wasn't there before. And suddenly the grandchildren of these survivors would begin asking their grandparents to share their stories. And I think that's what we found with Project Dastan, that almost always it was the grandchildren who were urging their grandparents to go along with this process.
I think that's something that Anchal Malhotra has pointed out too also, right? That it's the third generation that really has inspired a lot of these stories to be shared.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to your book. I mean, how did we get from your involvement in something like Project Dastan to writing a book not just about 1947, but about 5 partitions that you identified during the mid-20th century?
So I think initially we found all of our partition survivors through things like Instagram and Twitter. Anyone who kind of DM'd us, we would sort of say, "Yeah, we're happy to help." And but within about a year or two, we began to realize that it was a self-selecting group of people who had access to things like Instagram, and that we weren't getting a very geographically or culturally or caste diverse group of people coming to us. So we made a point of trying to reach out to other communities. And it was this conversation with this man in Tripura that changed everything for me, because I was asking about how partition affected his family and his area. And he asked which one. Because for him in Northeast India, there were three partitions. There was 37 when they were cut off from Rangoon. There was 47 when he was cut off from Dhaka. And then there's 71 when went from being East Pakistan's capital to Bangladesh's capital. And each of these were accompanied with another wave of refugees and migrations. And seeing it together in that way got me fascinated, in particular because Burma features so little in our imagination, in Delhi at least, of partition. And I think it features very little in our idea of undivided India, which, as I talk about in the book, is essentially a concept that only exists in reality for 5 months in the course of 1947. And yet, every school child in Delhi and in Pakistan will learn that undivided India was this kind of, eternal thing. When in fact, for most of its existence, the Raj was much, much faster than that. And as I began to read more, I realized that it stretched from the Shan states on the borders of Thailand in the east to Aden in modern day Yemen in the west.
So, in your book, you identify 5 partitions, and I wonder if you can first tell us what each of those partitions were, and then we'll get into salient features of each.
Absolutely. So the first one that sets the ball rolling and in a sense begins the domino effect of partitioning is the separation of Burma in 1937. This leads to things like the Rohingya crisis and Burma's civil war. After this, you get the gradual separation of the Arabian states, Yemen, Oman, Dubai, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Kuwait, all of these regions of the Arabian Peninsula, with the exceptions of Saudi Arabia and North Yemen, we often forget were part of the Indian Empire and were, governed by the Indian political service, had Indian passports, etc. They're all separated off gradually between 37 and 47. In 1947, of course, we see the great partition of British India along religious lines into India and Pakistan. But there's a fourth partition that occurs a year later, where the princely states are basically kind of ordered to join one of these new dominions. Some 20 join Burma, about 12 join Pakistan, and about 560 join India. And in the process, about 80% of the present day India Pakistan border is formed, and about 30% of the India Bangladesh border is formed. So, not all of the line that we call the Radcliffe line, the majority of what we call the Radcliffe line, Radcliffe never actually touched with his pen. And then finally, in 1971, in the wake of the Liberation War, between December 71 and then about 75, you get the gradual partitioning of Pakistan into two new sovereign states, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And, I think people often end with the kind of signing of the document that creates Bangladesh. But of course, at that moment, no one's yet figured out what's going to happen to all the banks and all of the people. There's a whole process by which people are subsequently divided between the two newly emergent nations. People who get stuck in between, for example, the Biharis of Bangladesh, the non-Bangla speakers of Bangladesh, and of course, the Bengalis of West Pakistan. All of these new people have to find out where they belong in the new order. So that's the fifth partition that I talk about. And the basic premise of the book is that in the 5 decades between 1921 and 1971, these 5 partitions occur that transforms one Indian empire into 12 nation states: Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar.
When we talk about partition, we overwhelmingly talk about Punjab. This is obviously something we talked about in the Litfest conversation. And to a certain degree, we'll talk about Bengal. And of course, 1971 is a division which will resonate quite a bit in Pakistan. Yet, why is it that we haven't seen the bigger picture? I mean, the picture that you've outlined here. I mean, I'm struck even within, say, the world of academic history. There's been very little discussion about the interlinkages between these various partitions. I mean, there is some work here about, connections between Burma and what happens in 1947, and of course 1971 and 1947. But there's been very little about putting it all together, from Aden all the way down to the border with Thailand. Why do you think why do you think this has been the case?
I think there are many reasons, and they layer up on one another, So for one, with each partition, like archives themselves are divided. So, most people in the Gulf didn't, there's very little evidence of these connections in the Gulf today because the entire history of the Gulf from when it was part of the Indian Empire is actually sitting in the Maharashtra State Archives. In addition, you get the rise of area studies during the Cold War, which is actually based off of essentially military departments during World War II. You had Middle East Command, South Asia Command, and Southeast Asia Command. And after World War II, during the Cold War, that's how new academic officers were organized, so that Southeast Asian scholars, as someone studying Burma is far more likely to study Thailand and Indonesia alongside it than the subcontinent. Likewise, someone studying India is far more likely to study Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which wasn't part of the Raj, than to study Burma as well. And likewise, the Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc., are all studied by Middle Eastern scholars, more likely to focus on Damascus and Cairo than they are to focus on Bombay, which was actually far closer tied to the Gulf for most of the 20th century. So there's all these different reasons. I think also different stories were promoted by each of these countries in the wake of their independence. New nationalist narratives were built. And so, for example, I think that the foundational narrative of Indian and Pakistani nations are 1947, and it brushes over what happens beforehand. It often comes as a surprise to Indians and Pakistanis when they reach Bangladesh and they see how 71 is the foundational story and that 1947 barely gets mentioned. A lot of Bangladeshis don't actually know that 1947 occurred. And I think Joya Chatterjee writes of her surprise chatting to someone in Khulna about partition, and they thought that she was talking about 71, had no idea that there was a West Bengal and that they had been partitioned in 47. And I think that the same amnesia occurs in all three of these countries with regard to Burma, for example, in Yemen. I also think that each of the princely states that survived have, in a sense, tried to reassert their ancient hegemony over their borders. So Nepal claims to be an ancient concept. Dubai claims to be an ancient concept, and they claim a sense of unbroken sovereignty thanks to their rulers and brush over the fact that their monarchies were brought in as princely states but then escaped the princely state system essentially. And so I think that each country hasn't been particularly keen to focus on this stuff. And likewise, I think India and Pakistan brush over the princely states that escaped because so often India and Pakistan try to undermine the idea that princely states could escape because of the whole demand for Kashmiri independence. So, the fact that the Maharaja of Kashmir had demanded Kashmiri independence on the basis that Nepal and Bhutan were doing the same is kind of increasingly attempted to be brushed over by both the Indian and Pakistani states, who of course claim Kashmir in their entirety today.
That's a good opportunity to talk more about nationalism. I mean, nationalism, as you mentioned, is hardwired in each country's story of origin, and 1947 or 1971 is kind of like a lodestar, depending on which country you're in, or 1937. But the one striking thing about your book is that you eschew these nationalist narratives. And in your narrative, it's quite incredible how no one really comes out of the story looking good. Not even someone maybe like Nehru, even, right? I mean, there are significant flaws in each of the parties that you talk about who are negotiating the borders from the 20s until the 70s. So with that in mind, I want to ask you, what has reception been like to your book? I mean, for something that flies in the face of these hardwired nationalist narratives in a time of hyper-nationalism, how have people reacted to your book?
I think overwhelmingly positive in a way that I wasn't quite expecting beforehand. In fact, the only kind of negative responses that I've had are from the Gulf, where kind of Emiratis are shocked to discover that they were part of a princely state and were legally considered Indians for 100 years, because that flies in the face of their whole kind of sense of cultural superiority over Indian migrant labor. The fact that they were the lowest ranking princely states in the Raj, below Jaipur, Jodhpur, Travancore, Cochin, etc., is shocking to a lot of Gulf Arabs. Within India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, I think there is a desire for more complex histories. And I think that particularly with the political tussle at the moment over Nehru's legacy, Savarkar's legacy here, with Jinnah's legacy in Pakistan, with the Mujib's legacy in Bangladesh, there is a sense that I think increasingly people are kind of bored of these lionizing narratives that brush over complex human beings as these kind of monolithic founder of the nation types. I think that we've seen, even amongst Indian liberals, there's a sense that a lot of Gandhi's sexual practices make people deeply uncomfortable. And yet they also, I think, the same liberals will be exhausted when they hear another person from the BJP talking about how Nehru was constantly kind of doing bad things. And I think that each of these people deserves far more complexity in the way that we tell their story. Likewise, Savarkar, his story deserves to be told with more complexity. Subhash Chandra Bose deserves to be, and to some extent, we've fought for far too long. I think who you support in the nationalist framework has felt a bit like a kind of football team. If you support this political party, then you support this historical figure, and history doesn't work like that. And I think readers themselves are aware of that, and I think have appreciated the complexities that I've tried to draw on, and the way that I've tried to turn these people often into kind of human beings with flaws.
I hope you're right, expressing the idea that people are wanting more complex histories. Because you're right. I mean, in a lot of popular Indian history or histories elsewhere in South Asia, we tend to kind of reduce people to being either heroes or villains, right?
Yeah.
History is black and white, and those various shades of gray in between are oftentimes just completely lost.
I think you can see it in all sorts of bits of history. You see it in the kind of YouTube clickbait title, was Savarkar right or was Nehru? As if it has to be a kind of a simple binary between only these two figures. And as if there weren't a million other options that people were considering far more often at the time. You see it in the same thing with, for example, Mughal history, kind of, the dichotomy that's drawn between Akbar and Aurangzeb, rather than trying to understand the complex times that these figures lived in. And it's often very tied to present day politics, rather than trying to understand what actually happened.
Absolutely tied to contemporary politics. So let's use that opportunity to go back to April Fool's Day of 1937 and look at two of the first partitions, the separation of Burma and Aden. When reading your book, I think many people will be very surprised to learn that there was actually a great deal of opposition in Burma towards the separation of Burma from the rest of India. Why was this the case?
I think that people forget the extent to which our ideas of India were forged in this moment. I think actually reading your book on Nauroji was one of the first moments that it began to click for me how contested the idea of forging a single independent post-independence India was at the time. Because, in some sense, the British hadn't conquered India as we see it today. The British had conquered the Mughal Empire and the Maratha Empire and the Burmese Empire and 100 different splinter kingdoms. And, in the 1890s, you still have Punjabi politicians saying maybe we should reform the Sikh Empire. You still had Marathi intellectuals thinking that maybe we should refound the Maratha Empire. And I think what's fascinating in the 1920s is how much this idea that we want to found something entirely new, and that is a nation along the geographical contours of Bharatvarsh, this ancient idea that dates back to the founding of the Mahabharata, but that had always been a cultural unit rather than a political unit. Bharatvarsh, stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, stretching from Sindh to Assam, has been invoked for at least 3,000 years, potentially more. And yet it has never existed as a single political unit. It's in its entire existence. That begins to change in the 1920s. And so within Burma and in Arabia, you have a very fervent argument. Do we want nationalists to inherit the steel frame of the empire, including Rangoon, including Aden? Or do they want to break it up and forge something different? And a lot of Indians, present day Indians, are arguing that no, we want, including Gandhi, for example, is arguing that he wants to forge an Indian nation along the contours of Bharat. Whereas Burmese politicians are actually arguing at the time for a sort of EU style system. Let's kick out the Brits, but retain the steel frame of empire and create a kind of. And so this guy, Mahatma Uttama, who's Gandhi's great disciple in Burma, will later turn on Gandhi in the course of the 1930s as they disagree over whether Burma has a place in a future Indian nation or not. Gandhi says no, Uttama says it does. He says, in fact, that Burma is an integral part of Indian identity, which again is a completely alien concept to us. And actually, in Yemen, similar debates are going on. There's a guy called Muhammad Ali Luqman, who imagines a future where Aden and the Gulf states are part of an independent India, and where Arab is an Indian ethnicity alongside Bengali, Punjabi, Telugu, Tamil.
Which, if you think about it, is kind of in keeping with the longer history of the subcontinent, right? I mean,
Precisely.
you've had Gujarati speakers in Arabia, you've had people from Arabian territories within India, you've had Burmese in what is today India, and you've had a large community of Indian traders all throughout the littoral of what is today Burma.
Precisely. I think a lot of people, when talking about my book, have asked, oh, but aren't these connections to the Gulf and to Burma essentially created by British colonialism? And I argue that, on the contrary, this kind of Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism long precedes the British. And in a sense, what is new as a result of the colonial period is the idea that these regions should be sort of ethnically pure and culturally pure to begin with. The idea that Arabs don't belong to India or that Gujaratis don't belong to the Arabian Peninsula is the new colonial imposition, not that Gujaratis were in Arabia and that Arabs were in India.
So in Burma, at least, we go very quickly from a moment where someone like Mahatma Uttama is disagreeing with Gandhi and saying Burma is an integral part of India, to a moment where by the mid 1930s, you start to see a very strong streak of anti Indian xenophobia, and indeed, as you refer to, pogroms, racial pogroms against the Indian community. What changes in Burma in the 1930s?
So, yeah, there's this huge debate in the 1920s about Indian immigration that deeply politicizes the issue. So, I think Rangoon becomes a majority kind of Bengali and Tamil speaking city rather than Burmese. And there's a sense, a bit like the lead up to Brexit, that, society divides down the middle on whether immigration, mass immigration, has been a good thing for the city. There's a quote from 1933 that, until recently, New York City was the largest immigration port in the world. Today it is Rangoon. So the Burmese dream overtakes the American dream. This is the origin of songs that we all know, like Mera Piya Ge Rangoon. This huge migration that occurred that, again, we've eviscerated from the history books, and yet was transformed Burma into the richest province of the Raj. And in some sense, the ancient idea of Suvarna Bhumi, the lands of the East being the lands of gold, is re-invoked in the course of the 1920s. Now, what begins to change is multifold. One, there's a rebellion in Burma, and the Indian army is sent in to quash it. And so suddenly, for the average Burmese peasant who has been arguing fervently that they are, Indian citizens, suddenly there's a bunch of Punjabis and Pashto speakers of the Indian army coming to shoot up the villages. And that creates a very anti-Indian sentiment in the countryside. But then the final cutting point is the Great Depression. The Great Depression, the entire economy of rural Burma had been essentially funded by the Chettiars of Tamil Nadu. So if you go to Chettinad today, you'll see these gorgeous teak mansions made from Burmese teak, cuisine that's very linked to Burmese cuisine. And, everyone knows that there's this huge Burmese influence down there. These are the bankers who have basically opened up the agricultural frontiers of Burma. And yet, when the Great Depression happens, farmers mass default on their debts. And in the course of 6 years, the Chettiars become saddled with 1/4 of Burmese agricultural land because no one's able to pay their debts, and so they take the land instead. And in the wake of this, suddenly these debates that are already going on about can the Burmese ever feel Indian suddenly take on a very different dimension. Suddenly Indians are perceived as a very real threat, perhaps even more of a threat than the British themselves. And so by 1937, the partition happens. By 1939, this guy called Uso is organizing anti-Indian pogroms. And by the early 1940s, 366,000 Indians flee Burma on foot over the Patkai Hills in what is essentially the first Great Partition migration. Although it's 4 years after partition, it is a direct result of the debates happening around it.
Uso is a particularly fascinating figure. I mean, someone who builds up a career actually defending Sun, who, as you mentioned, led a rebellion and who was actually opposed to Burma's separation, but over time develops his political capital by fomenting violence against the Indian community, and of course is eventually hanged for being implicated in the assassination of Aung San in 1937. Can you tell us how it was possible for someone like Uso to really build up a political base with sentiment directed almost entirely towards the outsider influence of Indians, and how in many ways the roots of the conflicts we see today in Burma, whether it's the Rohingya or the different ethnic, conflicts we see in places like the Shan state or the Karen state come or originate to a certain degree from this era.
Well, I think it's the moment that you realize it's not surprisingly different from what's going on in the rest of India is the moment that it all clicks into place. Usor is drawing from exactly the same playbook that, for example, the RSS is drawing on at the time, and the Muslim League National Guards is drawing on at the time. It's this idea that we had a great civilization and that outsiders came and destroyed it. And I think that the link with a lot of Hindu nationalist movements is key to the early rhetoric that he builds. It later transforms and it later moves very away from what the RSS is saying, but it's forged in that same moment of 1920s debates about, the consequences of the British Empire and being connected to very different populations, essentially. So he begins to develop cultural capital on this. That we had a pure Burmese civilization, then the Indians came, and particularly the Muslims came and destroyed it. And he draws up a list of ethnicities that need to be pushed out of Burma. So that includes Bengalis, Tamils, Hindustanis, but crucially also a group that speaks a Bengali dialect called the Rohingya. And the modern Rohingya genocide was justified explicitly on the basis that the Rohingya appeared on Usor's list.
We'll shift our focus now from Burma to the other end of the Indian Empire, to the Arabian Peninsula. And at a time when Rangoon was, of course, a Bengali-speaking city or a Tamil-speaking city, Aden was also, to a certain degree, a Gujarati-speaking city. And you have a rather provocative line in your book where you note that aside from a few administrative changes, such as one done in 1937, most of the Arabian Peninsula, except for Saudi Arabia, might have been a part of India or Pakistan at the time of independence. And this, of course, includes the modern wealthy Gulf states, places like the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait. How did all of these territories get lumped into the British Indian Raj in the first place? And how does this start to splinter starting in the 1930s?
Sure. So I think Aden is the first one. In the 19th century, it's one of the first acquisitions, I think, of Queen Victoria's reign. I might be wrong there, but I think it's, Aden is this very early acquisition. And as a result, becomes a direct part of British India rather than a princely state. It becomes the refueling station initially for ships traveling through the Suez Canal. Later, the Brits start wanting to stop what they call piracy. Of course, whether or not the rulers of Abu Dhabi or Oman actually considered what they were doing piracy is obviously, the Brits were the ones they considered the pirates. Where the hell did these Europeans come from? But basically, they eventually subjugate all of these states that existed along the littoral into kind of protectorate treaties, essentially. But they're kind of still separate. The turning point is 1903. Lord Curzon, who's about to do the first partition of Bengal, comes over to Sharjah and hosts a darbar, like the Delhi darbars of Delhi, and inaugurates them basically as Indian princes and adds them on to the Indian Empire, establishes or transforms what was increasingly known as the Persian Gulf Residency into a residency like any other in the Indian subcontinent. So like the Hyderabad Residency or the Rajputana Residency, suddenly there's a Persian Gulf Residency. Over the coming decades, many of these Arab elites learn Urdu. The sultans of Oman go off to Mayo College and famously become more fluent in Urdu than they are in Arabic. And Urdu remains the language of the Omani army well into the 60s. You also get these earlier pre-colonial links between Yemen and India, pushed forward. So you have much of what's now Eastern Yemen, becoming vassal states of the Nizam of Hyderabad. These Yemeni sultans become jagirdars of the Nizam. They bring a Yemeni dish to the court of Hyderabad, mix it with Telugu spices, which becomes the famous dish halim. And if you look at images of Yemeni and Omani elites from this time, what's most striking is the fact that they are not wearing what we now think of as the traditional Gulf dress. They're all wearing shirwanis. And that at the time, and they were wearing Kashmiri turbans. In a sense, what we now consider traditional Gulf dress is far more modern than we think. And before that, they were all wearing Deccani dress. And I think the other thing that we need to remember is just like the Arabian littoral at this time is mostly Arab, but with huge Gujarati speakers dotted around, far more connected to Gujarat than we tend to realize. We forget that Gujarat also had several Arab sheikhs ruling bits of Gujarat. There were several princely states like Mangrel, which were run by Arab sheikhs and were considered Arab sheikdoms in much the same way as Dubai and Bahrain were.
Yeah, again, those Indian Ocean commonalities are much stronger than we realize, right? I mean, places like Janjira, of course, had links with Abyssinia going back
Yeah,
centuries.
precisely.
So we've covered the first two partitions now. So by 1937, Aden has been split off. Burma has also been split off into its own crown colony. How do these first two partitions, and especially Burma, influence debate about dividing India? I mean, we're getting to a point now where people are talking about the idea of Pakistan. It's the early 1940s. Jinnah, of course, has given his Pakistan declaration, where he hasn't mentioned the term Pakistan, but people are slowly connecting the two. So, how does the precedent of Burma influence people's opinions about potentially partitioning India into a Hindu majority and a Muslim majority sector?
The very vocabulary for the word partition should tell us everything that we need to know. I think it's revealing that the first document in history to mention the word Pakistan, Rahmat Ali Chaudhry's 1933 pamphlet, justifies its creation on the basis that Burma was being created. He says, if Burma is to be separated, it makes no sense to me why the Muslims of Hindustan must be forced into an Indian union. And that is his justification for the establishment of Pakistan. The first ever justification for the creation of Pakistan justifies it on the basis that Burma had just been separated.
And even people like Ambedkar also invoked the partition of Burma, correct?
Yes, yeah. I mean, Ambedkar does it. Jinnah does it. Jinnah, we forget. Jinnah's concern about Hindu rule is essentially only really madly triggered in the wake of this first partition, because until 1937, there had been far more Arabs and far more Burmese people in the Raj. And so it had been less of a Hindu dominated land. And there had been areas outside of what was considered Bharat Varsh. But 1933, the 1937 partitions had explicitly cut off all of the non-Hindu bits of the Raj, in a sense. And in doing so, created the fear that Muslims could potentially be dominated in a new Raj by this Hindu majority, because it hadn't been as much of a majority beforehand.
Simultaneously with discussion about partitioning India and creating Pakistan, you of course have the fate of the 500 odd princely states. And as you know, we don't know how many princely states they were. Every time someone would put up a list, the number would change a little bit. And of course, most of these states are rather small, relatively insignificant, but a few, like Mysore or Hyderabad or Baroda, were basically, as you talk about in your book, nation states in waiting. They had modern bureaucracies, state supported industry. Hyderabad had its own airline, Deccan Airways.
Yeah.
How do we end up with a situation where relatively minor states like Bhutan or Abu Dhabi or Dubai, minor states at the time, remain independent today, whereas a place like Hyderabad, which again, seemed on its way to becoming a separate nation state with its own passport, with a developed railway system, completely disappear off the map?
I think this is one of the great forgotten stories. And I think if you were to ask someone in the 1920s what they imagined the post-colonial landscape to look like, they would have assumed that Hyderabad, Mysore, etc., had survived, and they probably wouldn't have expected Dubai to survive. In some sense, the UAE, a federation of different little kingdoms, is what most people would expected to happen to the princely states. They would have federated and made something separate. It's complete political contingency. And I think that the Indian state's very harsh reaction to Hyderabad's attempt to remain independent, or Pakistan state's harsh reaction to Balochistan's attempt to remain independent, essentially emerge from the chaos of partition. And beforehand, there was far less expectation that these states would necessarily be forced into a new union. I think, again, we forget the extent to which the Maharaja of Kashmir justified his attempt for Kashmir to be independent entirely and to become the Switzerland of the East. This is always mentioned as a kind of crazy pipe dream in most books on this period. And what I came across in the archives is that he's doing so on the explicit justification that Nepal and Bhutan have just been allowed to do so on the basis that they are Himalayan states. And, Kashmir is also a Himalayan state. So it was far less crazy to imagine these states remaining independent at the time. And it's simply through a series of politically contingent moments that, and of course, the actions of Sardar Patel and VP Menon in particular, that lead to a cascading effect whereby most princely states aren't independent today. What we forget is that if you go to the Partition Museum in Amritsar, it's a deeply emotional experience, brilliant museum. You get to the room on Independence Day, and one of the most shocking things is the front cover. I can't remember if it's the Hindu or the Hindustan Times, but it's a map of the new nation of India, and there's not a single princely state there. It's this kind of moth-eaten India that visually seeing it on a map, what India was like on its Independence Day, is shocking to us. It doesn't feature Hyderabad, it doesn't feature Rajasthan, doesn't feature Gujarat, doesn't feature Manipur, doesn't feature Kashmir, doesn't feature Tripura, doesn't feature Chhattisgarh, doesn't feature half of Jharkhand, doesn't feature large portion of Meghalaya. It doesn't feature Mysore and half of Karnataka. This is a map that we are deeply unfamiliar with, and yet was the reality of what India looked like on Independence Day.
You point out that when independence happens in August 1947, it's not just the independence of India and Pakistan, but also about 300 princely states as well.
Yeah, and many of them celebrated that day. Most notably, Hyderabad had the most famous celebrations, celebrating Hyderabadi independence. But I think far too often we brush over the fact that several states in modern-day Orissa celebrated their own independence. Several states in modern-day Gujarat celebrated their own independence. I think that most states had signed the accession. I think over half had signed the accession by Independence Day, but just under half hadn't.
So the other moving part of this whole process is, of course, the British administration. I mean, one thing that you mentioned in your book is that the attitudes of the individual viceroys changed quite a bit, depending on who we're talking about. I mean, someone like Linlithgow was quite close to the Muslim League. Someone like Wavell tried to kind of balance, the forces between the Congress and the Muslim League, and at the same time was very much against partition. But then you get someone like Mountbatten, who is very pro-Congress and also has a very strong line when it comes to princely state integration. Can you tell us about how attitudes towards partition and integration of the princely states change over the course of these three viceroyalties?
This is one of the most important things that I think, particularly in this country, where we grow up on this kind of idea of this very explicit policy of divide and rule. That divide and rule is there. But I think people assume that there's a grand plan, a grand conspiracy behind the wings. One of the things that's most shocking, I think, when you actually get into the declassified intelligence files, is how much people are making it up as they're going along, how much there isn't a grand plan, how much as we would like to imagine, as Patrick French puts it, kind of, a grand spider's web with a giant spider wearing a bowler hat in the center. In fact, it's a series of politicians making decisions on the fly. So Linlithgow, as you mentioned, basically lifts up the idea of Pakistan out of nowhere and turns it into a national debate. He's very partisan towards the Muslim League. Wavell's pretty even. He tries to initiate the cabinet mission plan, which would have allowed for a sort of Pakistan existing as a federal part of India. And then Mountbatten, of course, arrives, announces partition, but then becomes far closer to the Nehrus than he becomes close with the Jinnahs, who he hates. And these personal relationships very much have a very real impact on events as they develop. Princely states, likewise. I think that far too few viceroys really put their mind to the question of the princely states. Linlithgow, who does support Jinnah and the Muslim League, is actually one of the very early supporters of a pan-Indian federation, also including federating all the princely states. And for all that he's bashed by Indian nationalists today for supporting Jinnah, he's also one of the early people who begins the groundwork on integrating the princes. Wavell, despite his even-handedness with Hindu, Congress and Muslim League, really fails to even address the concept because of World War II. It's all put into cold storage, is the quote. And then Mountbatten arrives, initially doesn't pay any heed, and it's only around June 1947, a few months before partition, that he really gets a chance to put his mind to the question. And then eventually, he plays a massive role. He's convinced by VP Menon, he's convinced that Indians will forgive him for the partition of the subcontinent if he helps them double the landmass of the future Indian nation. And so Mountbatten then very much plays an active role in coercing 565 princely states to joining India. He doesn't do that, notably, to any of the Pakistani states, and he doesn't do that to help the Burmese states into the Burmese Union, but he does do that to help the Indian states into the Indian Union.
There's a nice quote from your book where you talk about how the princes, when Mountbatten is addressing them about, the need to accede to India, looked kind of like sheep being told by the head of their flock the best way to go to the abattoir.
Yeah, I think it's an accurate depiction of how it happened. And the princes had kind of assumed that Mountbatten would be their best ally, whereas Congress and the Muslim League had been very disappointed by Mountbatten's appointment as viceroy. The princes had assumed, well, here's an aristocrat related to the royal family who will help, us maintain our aristocracies. And in fact, this relative of the king helps usher into motion one of the great Republican moments in world history, the end of 565 independent dynasties.
Let's move on to some discussion about the violence that takes place in 1947. Now, we're all obviously familiar with what goes on in Punjab, and we've talked about that, but I want to circle back to what you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which is how talking about Tripura triggered your interest and your realization about how the story about partition is a bit more. And in your book, you do a good job of bringing this out, right? I mean, you talk about how, aside from Tripura, why are we not talking about a state like Hyderabad, right? Where we don't necessarily associate partition violence with South India, and yet we have, during Operation Polo in 1948, a tremendous amount of migration, right? Muslims going in to Hyderabad and then eventually leaving and going to Karachi, and Hindus fleeing Hyderabad and then afterward, relocating back in. Why, again, have these parts of the stories been left out? I mean, even again, when we think of Bengal, I mean, violence is going on in Bengal all the way to 1950 or so, right? Why has this been relegated to kind of the background when we talk about violence and partition?
It's a great question and not one that I can particularly answer. I think that the scale of the violence in Punjab is definitely the reason why it hits our imagination so much. These images of these trains crossing the border filled with bodies, etc. That is because specifically Punjab has more people in the Indian military at the time, and so there are more weapons around. And so the partition violence there is not involving lathis and knives, it is involving Gatling guns. And that's why Punjab was so much more violent. But the partition, as you say, produced migrations across South Asia. I think one of the more surprising things on my first visit to Lahore was to realize how many people from states like Uttarakhand or Himachal or Madhya Pradesh or Tamil Nadu there were living in Pakistan. Liaquat Ali Khan's wife, the first lady of Pakistan, Mrs. Liaquat Ali Khan, was from Almora. And, she'd migrated over from Almora. Liaquat Ali Khan himself has migrated over from Haryana, from Karnal. The state of Hyderabad, so Telangana and Karnataka and parts of Maharashtra, saw 3 times more migrants in the course of 1948 than the Palestinian Nakba saw the same year. So it's enormous in scale, and yet somehow gets left out of the story. We say, you chat to most people in the South and they say, oh, it just affected Punjab. It's a Punjabi story. Likewise, I think we tend to forget that, like in Sindh, Karachi was a Hindu majority city before partition. Delhi and Agra and Lucknow were all basically Muslim majority cities, although not quite, but very almost. Their largest populations were Muslim. And each of these regions were completely transformed by the events of partition. Today, one of the reasons why the politics of UP is what it is today is that the entire Muslim aristocracy basically migrated to Pakistan from UP, but the entire Muslim working class remained. And so today, if you look at a kind of a class map of UP, most Muslims are rather poor. Whereas back in the day, the majority of UP's aristocracy were Muslims from the old courts of Awadh, etc. And of course, the state that triggered this book as a whole, Tripura, is actually demographically one of the most linguistically changed by the events of partition. There was a majority Adivasi-speaking population, like Adivasi and kind of Twipra-speaking population, indigenous Adivasi languages-speaking population in 1946. And by the 1950s, it's a majority Bengali population as a result of mass influx of Hindu Bengalis fleeing what became East Pakistan. So, despite Tripura being one of the most demographically changed in partition history, when was the last time you read a partition book that focused on Tripura? When was the last time you read a partition book that focused on Meghalaya, which of course was a border state bordering East Pakistan and saw huge number of particularly Sylheti refugees arrive. And of course, one of the biggest ethnic groups in Bangladesh today are Biharis, and these Biharis arrive during partition. So again, this is a pan subcontinental event, and one in which even affected places like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. There's a Tamil speaking region of Karachi today, which is all the people who used to be associated with the kind of, the Nawab of Arcot's kind of Carnatic Sultanate, who migrate from around Vellore and from around Chennai.
We've talked now about the third and fourth partitions, and just in the interest of time, we don't have much time to talk about the fifth. But I do want to ask you, though, about how 1947 might or might not have set up events of 1971, which, of course, is the separation of Bangladesh from Pakistan. Was Bangladesh inevitable, in your opinion, given the circumstances of the creation of Pakistan, or was the idea of Bangladesh something that only really came into the fore much later? Even as late as 1970, 71. What are people saying about the unity of Pakistan from the perspective of East Bengal or East Pakistan?
Yeah, I think it changes quite dramatically. We've got to remember that in some sense, Bangladesh is where the idea of Pakistan began. The Muslim League is founded in Dhaka, and the only province to vote in the Muslim League in 1946 was Bengal. So in some sense, it's a far more important center of the Pakistan movement than Punjab was. And we've forgotten that today because of the events of 1971. Initially, although divided by thousands of miles, and although Jinnah gets a moth-eaten Pakistan, I think in the early days there was a lot of hope that these disparate communities could form a single nation. 4 of the first 8 prime ministers of Pakistan are of Bengali or East Pakistani extraction. Not all of them spoke Bengali as their first language, but they were from Dhaka. And I think that for me, the moment, although Bangladeshi's national history is kind of taught as the turning point is the language movement in 1952, my reading is that that things begin changing really when the first coup happens. So what happens is in 1958, I think it is, Pakistan's military takes over. And at that point, one of the legacies of partition was that only 2% of Pakistan's armed forces come from East Pakistan. And so in one fell swoop, you get the entire Bengali political class pushed out of office. And suddenly Pakistan, for the very first time, is dominated by Punjabis and Pashto speakers. And this is a real different thing from, the early days when it is very much dominated by Muhajirs, Urdu speakers. And then later, there are several Bengali prime ministers. But with the coup, that disappears. And increasingly in the course of the 1960s, you have Bengali politicians writing that it feels like colonialism never ended, that the East Pakistan has become a colony of West Pakistan. You don't get that language so much before the coup. And so for me, the coup, you get bits of it. And there's this forgotten Bengal famine, the 1954 Khulna famine, that definitely transforms public opinion. We tend to imagine that the Bengal famine stops with 1943 and that it's all the British fault. Famines continue in the Bengal Delta well into the 70s. And the 54 famine basically is what destroys the Muslim League's popularity in East Pakistan. 1958, democracy gets stamped on altogether. And very gradually, you have the rise of a kind of, movement for East Pakistani autonomy. It's increasingly referred to as Bangladesh, the homeland of Bengalis, particularly as the Bengali language is suppressed. You get the banning of Tagore, etc. Despite all this, for me, Bangladeshi independence only becomes inevitable in March 1971 when Yahya Khan, the general, of Pakistan declares Operation Searchlight and begins kind of massacring anyone associated with with the Awami League in Dhaka. For me, that's the big turning point beyond which there was a point of no return. I think Zulfikar Ali Bhutto ironically refers to this as the moment that saved a united Pakistan. And yet, in hindsight, it's the moment that doomed a united Pakistan. You can't just massacre your own population.
So that's a good moment to talk about one other thing, which is opposition to partitions. I mean, you talk about in your book how there's a moment where Mujib and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Khan nearly come to an agreement, right, in Dhaka before Operation Searchlight that could preserve Pakistan's integrity, but of course it all falls to pieces. And
In the Prime Minister's toilet. I mean, this is one of the more unexpected things I again found researching this is that Mujib and Bhutto were so terrified that all the rest of the rooms in the president's house would be bugged that all the negotiation happened in the president's toilet. You have three men.
unexpected archival
Yeah.
finds are always the best. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, this seems to be part of a larger theme, right? I mean, you had opposition amongst the Burmese, amongst a large part of the Burmese political elite towards partitioning Bengal of the rest of British India. You had several Adenis, like Lukman, who you mentioned, who saw themselves as Indian nationalists. And of course, you have a whole gamut of people opposing the partition of India, both Hindus and Muslims. How could this opposition to partitions have potentially created a very different map of South Asia? I mean, what were the other political possibilities that were on the table from the time of 37 onward?
Yeah, so there's so many. And again, this is something that I find so fascinating, the what ifs. Each of these moments is created by one of these closing doors moments. Anything was possible and then suddenly it's not anymore. I think, for example, Operation Searchlight is that moment for Bangladesh's history. Suddenly, all sorts of possibilities about a kind of confederation, which is what Mujib seems to actually have been seeking. Suddenly, the doors are shut quite dramatically. In the early days, I think Nehru and Aung San talk about a united states of South Asia in the not very distant future, a kind of confederation roughly resembling the Raj that's a bit like the EU, where they are separate nations, but they've relaxed borders and migrations allowed. And the economies that tied together this region during the Raj were allowed to continue and probably would have led to the country being very rich. Equally, as well as these kind of broader united ideas, Lukman and Ottoman both talk about the entire region remaining under a single government. Then you have very different possibilities where you could imagine different princely states having survived. You could have imagined an independent Travancore, an independent Hyderabad. In addition to, there was a movement for the Madras presidency to be separated off and made into a separate Dravida Nadu. The movement for Dravida Nadu was seen as much more forceful than the movement for an independent Pakistan right into the kind of, early 1940s. And then, in addition to all these, you have all sorts of other ones that have occasionally reared their heads. The origin for both the Khalistan movement and the Naga independence movement is forged in this moment when there are so many more political possibilities. So there's a whole group of people arguing that there should be a Sikh state, that there should be a Naga state. The idea of an independent Nagaland is forged on the basis of Burma. If Burma is separated, why can't Nagas also be declared a nation unto themselves? So there's so many different ways this could have gone. I think there's one rather amusing line. Someone's describing in mid 1947 how many political options appeared to be on the table. Again, options which we've all forgotten, with the exception of the Pakistan movement, right? And he says, some people are demanding Khalistan, some people are demanding Dravida Nadu, some people are demanding Achutistan, which was a perceived homeland for Dalits. There was a proposition for an Anglo-Indian homeland somewhere to be established in the Andaman Islands, and so there's a person who I quote in the book who says that frankly the most sensible of all of these states, the biggest divide, is actually for the establishment of a Jananistan, a homeland for women, because of course ultimately the satirist is basically saying the most oppressed group in South Asia are women.
Would have been much better for them, probably. I mean, reading your book and reading many other books on partition, one almost comes to, the realization that If you look at South Asia in 1947, it's probably very similar to, say, what the Austrian Empire was just before
Yeah.
World War I, or the Russian Empire was maybe in the early 20th century. I mean, there are all these different movements for regional autonomy. No one really knows how the borders are going to shape. Or, for example, the Ottoman Empire, right, upon its dissolution. And the eventual borders are due to so many different random incidents that are so hard to foresee when you're at the moment of independence, right? I mean, what
Yeah.
we have today was never inevitable, just as the map in the Middle East or the map in Eastern Europe is not inevitable either.
Yeah, and I think today every nation in the world projects their history back into the distant past. I think there was a review of the book that had this wonderful line, which is that today we imagine the nation state as the basic building block of global geopolitics in the world. And so to learn that about 30 modern nation states are younger than the internet comes as somewhat shocking surprise. All the states that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. That is a real shock to those who imagine. I think it also comes in the language we use. We talk about the British conquering India rather than the British conquering the Mughal Empire, the Maratha Empire, the Sikh Empire, the various Bengali kingdoms, various Tamil kingdoms. At the time, I think there was a rather wonderful line. Bhutan, when it's reasserting its independence from the Raj in 1946, Bhutan is asking for Darjeeling back. After all, Darjeeling was part of Bhutan before colonialism, and the British write a letter, the local officer rather writes a letter, and he says, sorry, but none of the states that are emerging from the Raj are their pre-colonial selves. If that was the case, we would not be granting independence to India. We would be giving Lahore to the Maharaja of Punjab. We would be giving Awadh to the Nawabs of Awadh. We would be giving, kind of central India back to the Marathas. We would be giving South India back to the Polygars. And in fact, what we're forging here is something entirely new. And I think that this is something that India, Pakistan, Burma, all of these states brush over how new their borders really are and how new the concept of these regions constituting a single nation really are. Nationalism itself is a modern phenomenon. Most people in the 18th century would not have considered themselves Indian any more than anyone in Britain would have actually considered themselves British. These are
Of
all
course.
recent identities. I think there's a lot of literature that argues that actually it's only really with the French Revolution that the idea of nationalism really kicks off in a big way. And the idea that these nations are eternal is wrong for every country on the globe. But the vast majority of kingdoms in the past were essentially just a bunch of kings went around conquering some places, and those farmers really didn't like being ruled by these places, so eventually shaked off their yoke. And it's fascinating just how recent the idea of the nations that I'd love for you, just before, as we're finishing, I'd love for you to chat a bit about how different the nationalism that Nauroji talks about is from the nationalism that's talked about in the 1930s.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of India was very different, and the idea for how India could potentially fit into the tapestry of nation states around the world was very different also. I mean, Indian nationalists 150, 140, 130 years ago were grasping at any possible reason or rationale to allow Indians to have some sort of political power. And one, quite ingenious idea was that, people who were nationalists from the city of Bombay came up with the idea that, look, well, according to the treaty whereby Bombay was given to the English from the Portuguese and eventually passed into the crown, Bombay was technically made a part of the estate of East Greenwich, which was a formula that was used around various parts of the English and British Empire in places like Virginia. And so Indian nationalists said, well, there you are. We are technically a part of East Greenwich, which is in England, and therefore we demand all the rights that anyone from East Greenwich should have also, like the right to elect our members of parliament.
Brilliant.
So yes, I mean, the conceptions of how people view India and how they see it as a nation state or a component of something bigger or smaller are very different. And I think, even in the early 20th century, you see a lot of debate amongst Indian nationalists about whether Burma is a part of India. I mean, you definitely see it in conversations within the Servants of India Society. Some members of the Servants of India Society, it was set up by Balkrishna Gokhale, as a nation building project, went out to Rangoon. And so there was discussion about, is this a part of India? Is it not? How should we, work with people on the ground in Burma? So there were a lot of different possibilities that were open and were being debated at this time. And one thing we also should remember is that, many of the early presidents of the Indian National Congress were not Indian, right? They were British, or they were Scottish, or they were Irish. And many delegates who attended the early Indian National Congress were American or Japanese, or people from different parts of the world. It was in many ways a more cosmopolitan political environment.
Yeah, and I think that one of the Sunil Amrit talks about how much in an age before planes, the sea was seen as more of a connector than a divider. So, someone living on the Tamil coastline
Yeah,
could get to Rangoon far easier than they could get to Delhi further
absolutely.
inland by train, which would take them months or weeks. But they could be in Rangoon within a week. And and you can see that very clearly in the statistics. Far more Tamils and Telugus and Oriyas were far more familiar with Rangoon and Burma than they were with North India and the Punjab. And so we've forgotten the connections that were produced by these kind of steamship liners. One of the things that I'm researching at the moment is the connections between French Pondicherry and French Indochina. And for most people living in Pondicherry, Saigon was the city that they were most familiar with outside of Pondicherry, far more than Madras, And so because of the ways that, so turns out that 30% of the voting electorate in Saigon or in Cochin China, southern Vietnam, were Pondicherry Tamils. 30%.
Wow, I didn't
And
realize that.
so there are these extraordinary linkages that are made over sea rather than over land. And one of the great changes that's happened in the course of the 20th century is that flip, that the sea now divides. People don't take ships as the main source of transport anymore, and people now look inland rather than overseas in order to seek out their futures.
Yeah.
Someone living in Pondicherry today will obviously think of, Chennai or Bangalore as the main places that they want to go to, whilst, someone living in Delhi will consider Kolkata as obvious a place to visit as Bangalore, and yet not go to Lahore, which Delhi and Lahore were connected for centuries, but very few people from Delhi had ever seen Kerala.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. And it's also interesting how these commonalities exercise a certain influence on later events. I mean, you bring up Anthony Mascarenhas, the famous reporter who reported on genocide in 1971 in East Pakistan. And of course, he came from a Goan family living in Karachi, which, unearths this whole history of Goan migrations to Sindh in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Precisely.
So I have one last question for you, and you've been very kind in spending a lot of time discussing. But I want to end by discussing the last line of your book. And you mentioned at the very end of your book, quote, "The last decade has witnessed the decline of globalization, the strengthening of borders, and the resurgence of nationalism across the world. India's partitions are a dire warning for what such a future might hold." End quote. And I'll use your words to circle back to the beginning of our conversation with your work with Project Dastan and talking about memories of partition survivors. As the post war order crumbles, as it starts to come apart due to the political headwinds that we've had in the past 10 years, what lessons can we learn from these partitions without slipping into the nationalist narratives that helped give birth to them in the first place?
I think the basic lesson is that things change very quickly. In each of these moments, it's, in my argument, August 1946, Pakistan is not inevitable. Sorry, July 1946, Pakistan is not inevitable, but by August 1946, it was. January 1971, Bangladesh was not inevitable. By March, it was. And each of these moments, it seems to me, occurs when we try to brush over our internal diversity and try to create some sort of uniform society, be it religious uniformity, linguistic uniformity, whatever it might be. It's these impulses for uniformity create far more damage than people tend to realize, and very quickly lead to quite intense violence. There's no better, I think, that we're seeing across the world as I mentioned in the quote, the decline of globalization, this moment that we had a decade ago where we imagined that kind of, all borders were gradually going to disappear and we were all going to be connected in this kind of, wonderful internet utopia. I don't think anyone thinks along those lines anymore. And I think that, there are very real fault lines that exist not only in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. Burma and Yemen really could turn into a series of new countries within our lifetimes. I think the civil wars in both countries create the opportunity for, India 10 years from now may very well have a new neighbor to its eastern front. The Myanmar government currently is not in control of much of the country, and we could very easily imagine a world where there is a new Kachin or, Chin states to our east. I don't see any further partitions in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh anytime soon without some crazy war breaking out. But, there was a war just this May. And I think we are living in incredibly uncertain times. And I think that a good thing to end on is the story of this man who I met whilst taking Project Astanavan. I think it's called Ziaul Hassan, who changed nationality 5 times in his lifetime, each through no will of his own. He was born in Bihar, migrated to Karachi, then became Indian again because Karachi didn't have any space and he left in the refugee camps. Then he moved to Dhaka instead after a series of pogroms pushed a bunch more Biharis out. Arrives in Dhaka, becomes East Pakistani for a bit. Then in 1971 happens. Biharis are no longer welcome in Bangladesh. He becomes briefly Bangladeshi, but then becomes Pakistani again. And finally, he moves to Britain, in some sense regains his earlier British Indian identity, and now works with Alzheimer's patients, running a company called Singing for the Brain, trying to bring people, and often will sing to communities of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Burmese heritage, all in the same care homes.
I think that's a very appropriate way to end, a very symbolic way to end our discussion. So thank you, Sam, for joining us today. I really appreciate our conversation, and I encourage our listeners to check out Shattered Lands. Thank you again.
Thank you.